founder of Increase the Peace, Berto Aguayo.
Hello, everyone. So I have the incredible honor, but also the very hard job of being the hype man for a man that needs no hype. So bear with me. My name is Berto Aguayo, and I am an attorney and the founder of Increase the Peace, a violence prevention organization in the south side of Chicago. Growing up, I never thought that I would make it past 18 years old, let alone be on this stage today. I was raised by a single mother who left Mexico and came to this country when she was just 16 years old and pregnant with me. She settled in the back of the yards neighborhood on the south side. We lived in a small 500 square foot apartment with 8 other family members. My mom was a hairdresser, my grandma worked at McDonald's, and my aunt worked at a tortilla factory. These 3 powerful women had to work day in and day out to put food on the table and a roof over our head. Even though they would have loved nothing more than to stay home and take care of us. And that impossible choice that they had to make, coupled with the fact that there were not a lot of resources in my community, meant that my options were limited. Just 2 weeks after my 8th grade graduation, I lost my first friend to gun violence. And at 13 years old, I joined a gang. Luckily for me, I had people in my community who poured into me and believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. A grocery store owner gave me my first job. A police officer mentored me, and my high school principal connected me to a life-changing job at an alderman's office, where I discovered my purpose of making my community a better place. At 17 years old, I decided to leave the gang, but to do that, I had to endure a 3-minute beating. My mother feared for my life, but I survived. Then, I founded an organization, Increase the Peace, with the mission of paying it forward and addressing the division within my own community. And with the support of the Obama Foundation's My Brother's Keeper Alliance, I was able to open an office on the same block where I grew up. Thank you. And that allowed us to create a safe space where youth could find and build community. And I stand on this stage conscious that my story is only possible because of my community. And I am overwhelmed with gratitude for the people who raised me and made this moment possible. And to me, that's what pluralism is. People of different backgrounds coming together to lift each other up and make each other's story possible. And that is also the story of our democracy. A democracy whose constitution begins with community. We, the people. Those words don't just affirm who we are. They imply a civic responsibility to build community, to build a more perfect union across our differences. As Cesar Chavez once said, we cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about progress and prosperity for our communities. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the needs and aspirations of others for their sake and for our own. And that's the essence of pluralism. Not just tolerating differences, but embracing them to create something greater. And at Increase the Peace, we've worked to embody that vision. During the George Floyd uprisings, tensions between Black and brown communities in Chicago tested the idea of pluralism, erupting into moments of violence. But through honest conversations, we confronted our own biases, and we realized that our seemingly separate struggles were actually intertwined, and that we didn't have to choose one community over the other. Instead, we could respond to the division by showing that we are stronger together. So, we decided to organize the city's first ever Black and Brown Unity car parade. With tension still high, we didn't know what to expect though. But it worked. In just 24 hours, hundreds of cars arrived at our local park, flying Mexican flags, Pan-African flags, and of course, American flags. What began as a response to division has now become an annual celebration of racial healing and pluralism, where communities come together to break bread, build trust, and confront new challenges head on. Last year, tensions over the migrant crisis and affordable housing nearly derailed the parade. But we listened to each other's pain, and we united once again, but this time around the shared call of housing for all. And that became the theme of the parade that year. Our collective actions have taught us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to turn division into unity, despair into hope. And that pluralism isn't just a goal. It's a choice that we can make with our actions every single day. In my journey, I've come to realize one undeniable truth. Community isn't just where you live. It's the people who lift you up when you stumble, embrace your humanity, and remind you that you belong here too. 6 years ago, as a young community organizer, I met President Obama, and he reminded me that I belonged in these spaces too. He encouraged me to keep building community and pursuing my dreams. Inspired by his example, I decided to go to law school with the belief that the law could be a tool to strengthen and unite our communities. And this June, just 1 month after graduating law school, I sat down with him once again, but this time as a lawyer. Alongside. Thank you. We sat down with him alongside other Chicago leaders to discuss how we were turning the promise of pluralism into action right here in our city. His leadership has shown me that the most important title that we all hold is that of a community member. He's reminded us that no matter where we come from or where we are going, we always have the power to choose pluralism. We always have the power to build community, to lift each other up, and to play a role in making our communities better and our democracy stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the absolute honor of a lifetime to introduce to you the 44th President of the United States, President Barack Obama.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Have a seat. Thank you. Have a seat. We're going to try to keep this on time. It is good to see all of you. Thank you, Berto, for the introduction. I am very proud of that young man. Thank you for everything that you're doing, Berto, for bringing people here on the south side of Chicago together. I want to thank all of our panelists, the amazing leaders from our network, the outside experts and thinkers and practitioners who took time out of their busy schedules to be part of our third annual Democracy Forum. Yeah. Now, I should tell you that when I mentioned to a few friends that our foundation would be hosting a forum on democracy and pluralism, I got more than a few groans and eye rolls. And it's understandable. After all, here in the United States, we have just been through a fierce, hard-fought election. And it's fair to say that it did not turn out as they had hoped. And for them, talk of bridging our differences when the country and the world seemed so bitterly divided felt like an academic exercise. It felt far-fetched, even naive, especially since, as far as they were concerned, the election proved that democracy is pretty far down on people's priority list. And I understood their skepticism. Maybe you had a conversation with a friend that felt the same way. But as a citizen and part of a foundation that believes deeply in the promise of democracy, not only to recognize the dignity and the worth of every individual, but to produce freer and fairer and more just societies, I cannot think of a better time to talk about it. You see, it's easy to give democracy lip service when it delivers the outcomes we want. It's when we don't get what we want that our commitment to democracy is tested. And at this moment in history, when core democratic principles seem to be continuously under attack, and when too many people around the world have become cynical and disengaged, now is precisely the time to ask ourselves tough questions about how we can build our democracies and make them work in meaningful and practical ways for ordinary people. And that's why we're here. That's what these forums have been about. 2 years ago, we kicked things off by examining the ways that we might counteract the flood of misinformation across the media landscape. Last year, we looked at how disruptions in the global economy and resulting rampant inequality is undermining faith in the democratic process. And we discussed how innovative economic reforms might give more people a stake in the system. So today we're focused on a third factor that healthy democracies depend on, an idea that political scientists often refer to as pluralism. Now, let's face it, pluralism is not a word that most of us use in everyday speech. I talked to one young leader earlier this year who's doing incredible work reducing gun violence here in the United States, and she admitted she had to look the word up right before our call. But the concept of pluralism should and is actually familiar to all of us. It means that in a democracy, we all have to find a way to live alongside individuals and groups who are different than us. So we commit to a system of rules and habits that help us peacefully resolve our disputes. We try to cultivate those habits, those practices that encourage us not just to tolerate each other, but also every so often join together in collective action. The pluralist ideal is what allows a Christian church and a Muslim mosque to sit side by side on the same city block and then maybe agree to share a parking lot. It's what keeps you from pulling down a sign in your neighbor's yard supporting a cause that you find completely irritating. And it keeps him from doing the same to you. It's what encourages you to team up with a coworker on a project and get the job done, despite the fact that the two of you disagree on abortion and gun ownership and the merits of Taylor Swift versus Beyonce. So this idea that each of us has to show a level of forbearance towards those who don't look or think or pray like us, that's at the heart of democracy. And it's hard. Even in relatively homogeneous countries, it's hard. It's not easy to maintain. Look what happened just this week in South Korea. But it's especially hard in big, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious countries like the United States. In fact, one way to think about the U.S. Constitution is as a rule book for practicing pluralism. So you get a Bill of Rights that allows us to think and speak and worship and assemble and vote on an equal basis, free from government coercion. And with that freedom, we can voice our beliefs and try to persuade others and form coalitions and compete for support and eventually elect representatives who will then go and negotiate and compromise and hopefully advance our interests. A majority rule determines who wins and who loses, but the separation of powers and an independent judiciary ensures that the winners don't overreach to try to permanently entrench themselves or violate minority rights. And just like a basketball game or a tennis match, we agree in advance that so long as the rules of the game are followed, the losers will accept the outcome of any given result, even if they still don't like the other side, knowing that they'll have another turn to try and come out on top the next time. So that's the theory. That's how pluralist democracy is supposed to work. It's the story that kids like me who grew up in the 60s and 70s were taught in school, what politicians and journalists wax nostalgically about when they talk about the good old days when both society and political parties were more genteel and less vicious and America came together to promote the common good. Of course, in America, at least, the reality never fully matched the ideal. It is true that in the decades right after World War II, our democracy seemed to run relatively smoothly, with frequent cooperation across party lines and what felt like a broad consensus about how interests were shared and differences should be settled. And part of this was the result of America's unique dominance economically in the aftermath of the Great War. So you have industrial competitors all across Europe and Asia who are still digging themselves out of the rubble at the time, which meant that fat corporate profits and rising living standards here in the United States helped smooth over friction between competing groups, between management and labor, or the industrial and agricultural sectors. And meanwhile, the Cold War generated solidarity against an external threat and a shared perspective on the world was constantly reinforced by a handful of TV networks, and movie studios, newspaper chains, and magazines that served as nearly everybody's main source of news and entertainment. Everybody watched Gilligan's Island, even if they didn't admit it. See, I know what generation you're from. But the biggest reason that American pluralism seemed to be working so well mainly had to do with who it left out. The fact is, for most of our history, our democracy was built on top of a deeply entrenched caste system, formal and informal, based on race and gender and class and sexual orientation. A system that excluded or severely limited big chunks of the population from the corridors of power. Just to give you some perspective, as late as 2005, when I was sworn in as Illinois' junior senator, I was the only African American in the United States Senate. One out of 100. Only the third since Reconstruction. Out of 100 senators, there were exactly 2 Latinos. And only 14 women. It's fair to say that when everyone in Washington looked the same and shared the same experiences and were in the men's side of the Senate gym, because the women just had kind of a closet that they had modified, cutting deals and getting along was a whole lot simpler. And then starting with the civil rights movement in the early 60s, things got more complicated. So in rapid succession, historically marginalized groups, blacks, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, women, gays and lesbians, disabled Americans, demanded a seat at the table. Not only did they insist on a fair share of government-directed resources, but they brought with them new issues born of their unique experiences that could not just be resolved by giving them a bigger slice of the pie. So racial minorities insisted that the government intervene more deeply into the private sector and civil society to root out long-standing systemic discrimination. Women, the gall of them, called for greater autonomy over their own bodies, while gays and lesbians stepped out of the shadows to demand equal treatment under the law, posing direct challenges to widely held religious and social norms. In other words, politics was not just a fight about tax rates or roads anymore. It was about more fundamental issues that went to the core of our being and how we expected society to structure itself. Issues of identity and status and gender. Issues of family, values, faith. Historically disadvantaged groups began to question the legitimacy of the system as a whole when they had played no part in writing its rules. Public arguments became louder and more contentious and more emotional. And in the face of all these challenges to the status quo, a lot of people, yes, those at the top of the pecking order, but also those who had just been raised to put their faith in authority and tradition, began to feel that their way of life, the American way of life, was under attack. This would have been a lot for any democracy to manage, even in good times. But of course, all this was happening against the backdrop of a rapidly changing economy. Changes that would massively increase inequality and widen the divide between rural and urban communities, and advantage so-called knowledge workers over those without college degrees. And And for a lot of Americans, such changes translated into stagnant wages and rising costs, and it increased their sense that others were benefiting at their expense. And that's not all. The new economy also upended residential and living patterns. So it reduced the likelihood that people from different backgrounds interacted at neighborhood stores or Little League games. People who are wealthier send suddenly their kids to private schools. So they're not only are their kids not interacting with regular folks, but they aren't either. It contributed to the weakening of, again, political science term, what folks call mediating institutions, unions, churches, civic organizations. These institutions that had once been the building blocks of democratic participation and a vital bridge between otherwise disparate groups. And more people found themselves isolated without natural communities. And with the Cold War over, with generations scarred by Vietnam and Iraq, a media landscape that would shatter into a million disparate voices, appeals to a common national story or a common national purpose increasingly fell on deaf ears. And we know what happened next, because we are still living it. What's been called the great political sorting that started with the mass exodus of Southern white voters from Democratic to Republican parties is now almost complete, with each party more and more uniform in its beliefs, less tolerant of dissenting views. Media companies have figured out that there's a profit in playing to the extremes. Since that's what gets attention, politicians and party leaders and interest groups are incentivized to take a maximalist position on almost every issue. Every election becomes an act of mortal combat in which political opponents are enemies to be vanquished, and compromise is viewed as betrayal, and total victory is the only acceptable outcome. But since total victory is impossible in a country politically split down the middle, the result is a doom loop of government gridlock, even greater polarization, wilder rhetoric, and a deepening conviction among partisans that the other side is breaking the rules and has rigged the game to tip it in their favor. Sheesh. No wonder my friends groaned when I told them what I'd be talking about. Now, before I go on, let me acknowledge I've been focused on the United States since that's what I'm most familiar with. But it's important to point out the particular struggles of every democracy differ depending on their cultural and political histories. The fault lines of division may be regional and linguistic, like they are in Spain, or religious, as they are in India and Northern Ireland, or ethnic, as they are in my father's homeland of Kenya. But no matter what country we're talking about, the same basic question remains. Can the idea of pluralism work in the current moment? And for that matter, is the concept even worth saving? I believe the answer is yes. I am convinced that if we want democracy as we understand it to survive, then we're all going to have to work towards a renewed commitment to pluralist principles. Because the alternative is what we've seen here in the United States and in many democracies around the globe. Not just more gridlock, not just public cynicism, but an increasing willingness on the part of politicians and their followers to violate democratic norms, to do anything they can to get their way, to use the power of the state to target critics and journalists and political rivals, and to even resort to violence in order to gain and hold on to power. We have seen that movie a lot. So how do we choose the better path? I'm not going to pretend that there are easy answers. Some of the trends I described played out over decades. Reversing them is going to take time as well. But as you've heard from many of our panelists today, we are seeing successful efforts around this country and around the world to reinvigorate pluralist values. And rather than just repeat what you've already heard from some of our panelists, I'm just going to try to quickly summarize a few quick principles for us to consider in our work. Point number one. Building bridges is not contrary to equality and social justice. In fact, it is our best tool for delivering lasting change. Today, there is a perception among some advocates that being adversarial is the main way to make change. Compromise and civility only serve to entrench existing power structures. And partly this reflects legitimate frustration over the seeming inability of the existing political process to get anything done. And they are certainly right that those in power have often cloaked their resistance to meaningful change by appealing to civil dialogue and lengthy deliberation and let's form a committee. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King scolded those who counseled patience and seemed more worried about social disruption than rank injustice, saying that there comes a time, Dr. King said, when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. But Dr. King, like Gandhi, like Nelson Mandela, also understood if you want to create lasting change, you have to find ways to practice addition rather than subtraction. So let me make this key point. Pluralism is not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It is not about abandoning your convictions and folding when things get tough. It is about recognizing that in a democracy, power comes from forging alliances and building coalitions and making room in those coalitions, not only for the woke, but also for the waking. Now, there are risks involved in engaging with groups you disagree with, particularly if there's a power imbalance involved. There's a risk when you begin to negotiate compromises that you'll give away too much, that you whittle away your issues to the point where it's hard to claim that you're making progress. And building bridges may require you to deal with people who not only disagree with you, but do not respect you. When I was president, there were times where, many times, where I was negotiating with people who made it pretty clear they didn't think I should be president. Legally, morally. But as long as we're clear about our core principles, as long as we know what our North Star is, we have to be open to other people's experiences and believe that by listening to these people and building relationships and understanding what their fears are, we might actually bring some of them, not all of them, but some of them along with us. And this is not just the job of leaders. This is an important point. Advocates and rank and file in any group have to be down for compromise as well. Now, a few months ago, I talked with a young advocate who said that a lot of her work was online. She gets rewarded for taking maximalist positions. And she gets punished sometimes if she suggests strategic compromise. Even though, and so her incentives led her often to say things that didn't necessarily jibe with how she was feeling, because she was constantly worried, looking over her shoulder, if she gave ground, in order to get 3/4 or half a loaf instead of nothing, she might be accused of selling out, which then led to fewer followers and fewer donations and ultimately less influence. So in a democracy, it's important to argue strongly for the issues we care about and draw lines that we're not willing to cross. But purity tests are not a recipe for long-term success. Point number 2, pluralism does not require us to deny our unique identities or experiences. But it does require that we try to understand the identities and experiences of others and to look for common ground. Let me make a note here. A lot of what's labeled identity politics is just folks trying to find an excuse to be able to continue to do what they've been doing in terms of feeling free to call people names or diminish them in some fashion. We understand that. And it's understandable that people who have been oppressed or marginalized want to tell their stories and give voice fully to their experiences, to not have to hold back and censor themselves, especially because so many of them have been silenced in the past. But too often, focusing on our differences leads to this notion of fixed victims and fixed villains, and it creates a presumption that our identities are all singular and static, that because you're a male, you automatically have certain attitudes, and let's face it, you're part of the patriarchy. I have 2 daughters and a wife, and sometimes I'm sitting at the dinner table, and I'm like, what'd I do? They pick on me all the time. You know that, brother. I'm the brunt of every joke. I'm like a sitcom dad. Or, if you're not black, you don't understand. You don't have standing to talk about race. My status trumps yours. Framing issues that way may keep things simple. It's easy to tweet. Is it still tweeting? Okay. Xing? I don't know. And it may feel satisfying in the short term. Unfortunately, it actually reinforces the sense that we are inevitably, immutably divided. And that makes it harder for people to reimagine how they might see themselves and they might see others. So in order to build lasting majorities that support justice, not just for feeling good, not just for getting along, to deliver the goods, we have to be open to framing our issues, our causes, what we believe in terms of we, and not just us and them. We have to try to frame issues in ways that at least consider the possibility of a win-win situation rather than a zero-sum situation. That's what Mandela understood when he befriends the man guarding his prison cell. That's what King understood in framing the issue not simply as an African-American issue, but as an American issue, right? Who are we? What are we trying to be? Understanding that the oppressor is as yoked and confined and limited by these systems as the oppressed. And we have to acknowledge that we all have multiple identities. I am a 63-year-old African-American man, for example, but I am also a husband. I am a father. I am a Christian who is constantly wrestling with his doubts about organized religion. I am a writer. I'm a Bears fan, which has not been easy. Recognizing and listening for those multiple identities as opposed to just looking at somebody and saying, oh, they're that kind of way. Being open to the fact that even the folks we disagree with most might have something that surprises us. That's an opportunity that we cannot afford to miss. Third point, pluralism works better when it is about action and not just words. Some of you probably remember this, right after George Floyd was killed, you got all these corporations who are putting up ads and hosting convenings, and then they're instituting mandatory seminars for their workers where everybody has to get together and talk about how they're probably racist and how deep the problem runs in our society. And I wrote down in the speech, while their intentions are good, but I'm not sure I believe that. There's a little bit of like, let's get over on the cheap, but let's assume sometimes the intentions were good. Nothing changed. And unsurprisingly, 4 years later, all those seminars disappeared. Words alone do not build trust. Words alone do not rid people of prejudice. What does build trust, because it builds relationships, is people banding together to get stuff done. Whether it's a mosque and a synagogue joining forces to help victims of a natural disaster, or a black community linking up with a traditionally hostile white community in Chicago to try to stop a highway from running through both neighborhoods. Such common efforts take time. They require an investment on the part of the participants. They won't eradicate people's prejudices, but they will remind people that they don't have to agree on everything to at least agree on some things. And that there are some things we cannot do alone. Which leads me to my final point. We're not born with the muscles to make pluralism a habit. It takes practice. And we need to rebuild the institutions that can give us that practice. Now, part of that, ideally, would be making government work better. You know, I believe, for example, that if we established nonpartisan redistricting here in the United States, it would encourage more candidates to compete for every vote, as opposed to just appealing to the most partisan members of their base. But let's face it, in our current polarized environment, political reforms are probably not going to happen anytime soon, at least not the ones I want to see. Which is why this may need to start by just looking for opportunities for people to once again become part of a society of joiners. Create more organizations from elementary school all the way through adulthood that bring people together to do something. And I'll give you an example. At a time when organized religion all across America is struggling, and in some cases, in some denominations, collapsing, mega churches are actually growing in leaps and bounds, in some cases really quickly. And while I'm sure there are a whole bunch of reasons for this, one of the reasons is that mega churches understand belonging precedes belief. If you show up at one of these churches, they don't start off peppering you with questions about, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your one and only Lord and Savior? You know, quiz you on the Bible. They invite you in, introduce you around, maybe give you something to eat, tell you about all the activities and all the groups that you can be a part of, from the Young Adult Social Club to the Ballroom Dance Group to the Men's Choir, which, for those of you who are not familiar, that's where they put folks whose voices aren't quite good enough to be in the main choir, but who are allowed to perform maybe once every fourth Sunday. Point is, oh, I'm sorry, brother, are you in the... You know what I'm saying is true. Point is, mega churches are built around this idea of let's just get you in here and get you doing stuff and meeting people and showing you how you can participate and be active. It's about agency and relationships. It's not about theology or handouts. And they're trying to create a big tent where lots of different people can feel comfortable. And once that happens, then they can have a deeper conversation about faith in a way that folks aren't spooked by. And what megachurches are doing is actually also a good argument for localism. A lot of us obsess about, and our press and social media obsess about what's happening in Washington, and I understand that, because it can be crazy. But a lot of our best work will happen from the bottom up instead of the top down. If we're going to get better at pluralism, it's going to happen in neighborhoods, in the communities where we spend our time, in the schools where our kids develop skills and learn how to negotiate and work together across differences. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, this all sounds pretty good, except pluralism depends on everyone following a certain set of rules. That's what you said, Obama. What happens when the other side has repeatedly and abundantly made clear they are not interested in playing by the rules? It's a problem. And when that happens, we fight for what we believe in. There are going to be times, potentially, when one side tries to stack the deck and lock in a permanent grip on power, either by actively suppressing votes or politicizing the armed forces or using the judiciary, the criminal justice system to go after opponents. And in those circumstances, pluralism does not call for us to just stand back and say, well, I'm not sure. That's okay. In those circumstances, a line has been crossed, and we have to stand firm and speak out and organize and mobilize as forcefully as we can. But even in those circumstances, it's important to look for allies in unlikely places. And too often we assume that people on the other side have monolithic views, when in reality some of them may share our beliefs in sticking to the rules, observing norms. And that's why, when it's appropriate, there is nothing wrong with reinforcing and lifting up elected officials or voters, your neighbors, your friends, who you may not disagree with anything, but they do agree with you on that, because they may be able to exert influence on people they've got relationships with within the other party. So, none of this will be easy. Building up these habits and practices that so often we've lost, learning to trust each other again, that's a generational project. Which is why I am so excited about the young people, some of whom you've already heard from today and who you will hear from in a moment, who are experimenting with different ways to do this. I'm thinking about leaders like Lumire Lepre, community organizer in France, who's training a network of rural change makers in a country where extremism dominates many villages. Or Ayu Kartika Dewi, who started a program in Indonesia that sends children and their mentors to different parts of the country during school holidays to live with a family from a different cultural background. Leaders like Lumire and Ayu are showing us the way. And what they're discovering is that when they apply the principles we just talked about, when they listen, they recognize their multiple identities, seek out common experiences and common values, they're not just strengthening democratic habits. They're building stronger organizations, which means they can deliver better results, concrete results for their members. That is the power of pluralism. That's how we break this cycle of cynicism that's so prevalent in our politics right now. And ultimately, that's how we're going to solve some of the greatest challenges of our time. So, I now want to bring a few more leaders up on stage who are doing amazing work. I want you to hear about what they're doing and how they're thinking about some of these issues. Please welcome Manu, Nika, and Ainka. Come on out, guys. Hear me? Okay, so these are some pretty impressive people. Some of you may know them. I am going to let them introduce themselves, but you know, I figured for efficiency's sake that I should probably just go ahead and ask a question, and then we'll just go down the line and you can introduce yourself and describe what you're doing while you're doing it. So here's my first question. All of you are doing work in this pivotal moment in very different contexts, but you're all grappling with some of the polarization division that we've been talking about at this forum. So just start off by telling me what's your basic approach, and give me maybe a brief sense of what you found most successful in what you've been trying to do and what hasn't worked so well. Nika, let's start with you.
Okay, so I will start with a secret. I think that often authoritarian leaders and people in power try to convince us that we are more divided than we actually are. I think that most of us want the same thing. We want safe home, we want to be able to pay the bills, we don't want to see kids being killed in terrible massacres, and we want a clean environment. And the story that I want to tell you is the story how we, in times of authoritarian government, decided to unite around common values. So we decided that it is not enough just to protest, but we decided to form a big coalition when government decided to attack the water. And this coalition was just terrible. We were so annoyed by each other. We didn't agree almost about anything. We were totally different. But at the end of the day, we always knew that we want to protect water. And we decided to believe in each other and in common value. And when you do this, magical things started to happen. People started to write to their neighbors about protection of water. Trade union of taxi drivers was driving people to the referendum about water that we called. Retired people and high school kids were on the streets speaking about water. And on the day of the referendum, under authoritarian government, half of the country came, and we won by 87%.
That's pretty good.
Yes, but like there was one person that was for me the most annoying person ever. And he is now a mayor, a really conservative mayor, of the most environmentally attacked city in Slovenia, called Anhovo. And I think I fought with him more than with any of my exes. But at the end of every day we...
Hold on a second. How many exes do you have? I'm teasing. You guys
but at the end
don't need to know that.
I will just continue and ignore this. But at the end of like every day we decided to trust each other. And this movement, this referendum, was basically a force that helped to change the government in Slovenia. And after a couple of months, the community of this small conservative city came back to my organization and they said, we need your help again. A lot of people is dying because of air pollution, because of lung cancer, and we want to change the law to protect the air. And again, the crazy feminists and the super conservative people formed a campaign, and we won this year again. And in the meantime, I started to coordinate a campaign for safe and accessible abortion in Europe. And I started to get a lot of attacks in my home country. And for me, this is quite hard because whenever I go to a public speaking engagement, I think that something will happen to me. So I had a talk about abortion in a city close to the city, this rural conservative city. And I thought that something bad will happen. But when I came to the venue, there were all these super conservative men laughing, waving, and being there. And I knew that they were there because that time they showed solidarity to me. And when I finished the speaking engagement, they all said, we will help you with the campaign. And this story is for me like something that is giving me hope in these hard times, because if you stick to your common values, if you see humanity in people, you get weird new friends, but also you can change the society.
That's fantastic. That's a great example. Go ahead.
So let me give a little context about Selma. When the Selma Center for Nonviolence was founded in 2015, Selma was deeply segregated, deeply divided. We were founded during the Bridge Crossing Jubilee amidst the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, Bloody Sunday, and lots of issues. 2014, Selma was our county was the poorest in the state. 2015, most dangerous place to live in Alabama. And 2016, the 8th most dangerous place per capita in the country. And we believe that broken relationships have led to broken economies, leading to broken communities. And so we started with those broken relationships. And people wanted to do something, but they felt like there were these two extremes to change that they felt like there was nowhere to go, particularly because there were more people, white people that we know of, to be killed in the voting rights movement. People had learned to stay in their place. Even if they didn't know the history, they knew the culture, they followed the culture, and they followed the tradition. And so we were very intentional about creating another space, this safer, braver space. And with restorative, creating a restorative culture, you use what you have in common to ensure that everybody has what they need. And sometimes for me, that has been using my faith. I'm Christian, and though our organization is not a religious institution, we believe in people being their authentic self. And though many of the people we work with live out their faith very differently than mine, I believe that multiple truths can be true. Multiple things can be true at once. And so we have to be careful in doing that, because when we don't, for example, when we cancel out people's fears or ignore their fears or dismiss their fears, untamed fears lead to hate. Doesn't mean we don't address truths, right? But like Dr. King talked about, we use unarmed truths, right? And so one particular woman that has been a part of our work is a white evangelical conservative who has very different political ideologies than I have. And yet she has recruited and invited more people to our Beyond Divide and Conquer, Unite and Build racial equity training than anyone else, not because it's soft, but because it's rooted in love. And she went on to organize our all-white private school and our black public school to do a haiku project. And it's not magic. It's not changing things overnight. I was in Israel and Palestine in May, and a Palestinian Christian young woman said, "Hope is honest." And so we have to be honest that divides are very great. And I believe that the promise is greater. I believe that Selma will change the world again, that we will be a model of the beloved community, and people won't just come for our history, but they'll come for our healing.
You know her? Look at you, oh, cheering for your girl. Manu.
Man, I should have brought my crowd plants.
Got to.
Obama USA leaders.
Well, I'll say.
Go. In the house.
I'll say, Nika and Anka, it's been an absolute pleasure to learn about your stories over the last few days. To the Obama Foundation, thank you for organizing this topic. I'm grateful for everybody listening about this subject, because I want to bring us back to a day that changed the trajectory of my life. So, President Obama, as I was hearing your speech and I was hearing us thinking through the subject, the one question that's been on my mind today is the question, how close are we actually to pluralism? How close are we? Because, you know, we can think through and talk about, should we have this conversation? Should we be pluralistic? Should we reach across the aisle? But I'm really curious about how close is this country? So I was a pre-med student. I had no interest in politics or democracy, any of this stuff. My mom's still confused. That's why I brought her to this event. And I want to thank you for you making the strong case for why this work matters. You know, February 2nd, 2017, I was a freshman at UC Berkeley. I was walking back from my math seminar, and there was protests in the distance and violence. And now this is Berkeley, so that's sort of par for the course. There's nothing special about that. But what was different about that moment was I was walking past this cafe, and inside the window was broken in. It said, CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. Now, again, I was not some political expert, so I didn't really know what that meant. But what was crazy about that moment was that the television crew that was filming that was standing right next to me. And that was sort of the breaking of the fourth wall. That's where I went from feeling like a spectator to, all right, we got to try and do something about this situation. Now, those protests happened because a speaker came to campus, and the next day, me and some random folks, one of whom my co-founder and best friend Ross Irwin was in the audience, we got together, and we said, let's create a space for the protesters and the protested to have a conversation. Now, you're sitting here, you know, we're having this conversation 7 years later. That's a very naive proposition. After the largest protests in Berkeley's history since the 60s, when Dr. King came to campus, we're going to try to, not political experts, we're going to try to get some of the most extremes in a conversation in a week after that. Well, we showed up, and you had that feeling in this room, right, where everyone is walking on eggshells. There's people that you can tell there's anger in their eyes. They're showing up with their fists clenched. People are not really sure where this conversation is going to go, and you certainly have the sense of, what's the point of all of this? What's the point of all of this? This conversation starts, and my friend Ross had a really smart idea. He said, what if we forget politics for a second? Let's just talk about who we are as people. Like, forget why you invited the speaker, forget, you know, why why we protested the speaker, what the limits of free speech are. You know, let's talk about our moms. Let's talk about our family. Let's talk about, why are you actually in college? Why did you skip class? You know, what drives you? And man, that vulnerability cut through human ignorance like a knife through hot butter. I learned one thing that day, and that is that we radically overestimate how divided we are, and we radically underestimate the power of a conversation. So I'll just wrap with this, which is, as we think about how close we actually are, I think we live at this time where we've let the worst caricatures of the other side define everybody on the other side. And the question becomes, well, what do we actually do about it? And my proposition would be that the chapters that we're building across the country and these student leaders that we're working with, as they're executing and organizing these dialogues, they're finding that most people in the real world are not the Twitter mob. And so the question becomes, how do you elevate that silent majority? And the way that I see my work is, how do you build a real movement around dialogue and pluralism, not as a defensive activity, but as this tool for actually thinking about how you're going to pull off, as you're articulating, the most ambitious democratic experiment in the history of humanity?
That's terrific. As I know all of you are familiar with, the statistics bear out, the surveys bear out what all of you are saying, that even in this deeply polarized moment, and I'm most familiar, obviously, with the statistics here in the United States, the most extreme, not only viewpoints, but also the most extreme attitudes towards the other side are actually among the small group that is most actively engaged and involved. And the people who are not actively engaged and involved actually do not jibe with any of this stuff. Don't even really track many of these disagreements and are just a bundle of contradictions, which, by the way, we all are. Certainly I am. And so that is a powerful starting point. I do want to ask, though, because all of you told sort of heartwarming stories, I want to ask about when you feel like you've kind of made a mistake in this process, either because you made assumptions about somebody, like your, you know, hardcore mayor friend, or that turned out to be disproven. But you might want to also talk about the fact that, well, sometimes you make an assumption that we have something in common and somebody disappoints you, or or for whatever reason, maybe because you approached it, you never were able to build the sort of relationship you were hoping for, and what you learned from that. I just think that it's, hope is honest, and I think it's important for us not to underestimate some of the barriers and challenges when we try to get people not just to tolerate each other, but potentially work together. So, anybody want to start, or you want to just keep on going down the? Go ahead.
I mean, I do mistakes every day, and luckily I have much smarter team than I am.
Me too.
Yeah, and one of the mistakes that I did almost was in the time of the authoritarian government. We were campaigning to change the definition of law about rape, and the Christian Democrats called a session in the parliament about sexual harassment. And I said, I'm not going there, I was invited. This is just for their political points, they will attack us, and I'm not showing up there. And my team said, are you stupid? Like, you will go there and you will tell the stories of women who experience sexual harassment, and you will demand systemic change from all of the members of parliament. So I usually do what they say, and I went there, and I went to the session, and I started to say those stories of these women. And at the end, I said that we need members of parliament to change the legalization to protect victims of sexual harassment. And across me, like this, there was this member of parliament, this woman from Christian Democrats, like a party where I almost never agree with. But she was looking at me, and she said, you know, I hear you, and I will do something that no one will think that I will do. I will be the first one to support your law. And in the next moment, a woman from the left raised her hand, from the most extreme left party, and she said, I'm with her. We are all here to support the victims of sexual harassment. And this story for me was so powerful because it showed up that my team was smart in two different ways. Firstly, to push me to go there, and secondly, to be really clear that I'm not there to search the dialogue. I'm there to speak about the victims, and I'm there to demand a solution. And those two brave and smart women heard me. We then changed the law, and I still admit that I almost didn't go to this session.
That's fantastic.
So I often say in our trainings that you will make a mistake. I often make mistakes in the world that language is ever changing, where we're trying to honor the identities of people that have been ignored and harmed. We will mess up, and it's so important that we take responsibility for the impact as we seek to move forward. And so this is a time that I've messed up. And so in another capacity, I'm the lawyer for a small local government in Alabama. And I knew some factual things. I knew that white nationalists had moved into the community. I knew that around the country, white nationalists were taking over local governments, trying to take over local governments, whether through school boards or city councils. And I had observed some concerning behavior. We have shared love agreements at the Selma Center, and the first one is identify assumptions, suspend judgment, and turn to wonder. It is my favorite one. I'm really good at turning to wonder, except when I don't identify assumptions. And I didn't identify an assumption because I had some facts, but I turned facts, individual facts, to a collective truth, and it was wrong. And out of order. And so one day after a city council meeting, because this is life work, not just a job, so we have to do it, follow these principles no matter where we are. And so after the city council meeting, I decided that I would have a conversation with some of these residents, requests that they didn't have the capacity to give, and the residents are happy because they're getting answers to questions they weren't getting. But that couldn't happen if I didn't suspend judgment, identify my assumptions, and turn to wonder.
So these were, just to be clear, these were white residents.
These were white residents.
But the question was, you know, how can they feel that they're part of, or that this government, because they might have some assumptions that maybe a predominantly black-run government, it was not going to be responsive to them, and that's what these conversations led to.
And to be clear, each side still has some assumptions, right?
I'll bet they do.
So it is not all settled, right? But we're finding a way to work together, and part of what pluralism says is that there are solutions to be had that we can only find if we're working together.
Yeah, I mean, the first mistake I made was not being a doctor. You know,
Are you still playing to your mom here?
I'm still playing to my
Okay.
mom. There was a strategic objective, and Anka and Nico know this very well. You know, when there's something you said in your 3 judgments, Anka, about 3 rules, and one of them was suspend judgment. And what's so powerful about that is it actually goes back to one of the first mistakes we had made, President Obama, doing this work, which was I saw it not for what it was, which was that pluralism is a way to see people the way they are and to actually understand not what they believe, but why they believe. Instead, I immediately jumped to it as a political tool to achieve my end. Now, I don't think that it can't be a political tool to achieve people's ends. But the one thing that I've learned over the last 7 years hosting these conversations, hosting these dialogues, is that people can sniff out your goal very quickly. And if we show up to a conversation with the idea being that I'm going to try to convince those people to come to my side in the next 45 minutes, I'm sorry to put a damper on this, but that's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is because, as you articulated, we're in a very divided moment where people fundamentally have applied the worst caricatures of myself to everybody on my side. And so as a result, the question becomes, well, if that's how people are approaching the conversation, how do we actually engage productively? And I think one of our students actually taught me this way of thinking, and this came after actually the October 7th attacks, where if you think about college campuses, you would imagine that college campuses are permanently set aflame. And yet our chapters hosted over 25 discussions about Israel-Palestine over the last year. We've got about 90 college chapters, 45 high school chapters. We engaged 11,100 students this year, which was this fall, which was, for the record, more double what we engaged last year. And I say all of that to articulate that I think people are craving honest connection. Because when they can then trust us and say, okay, this is why this person is telling me this idea, suddenly opens up their heart to the possibility of what is actually doable. I'll just share this last thing. Every one of these, and I'm sure y'all have seen this in your work, whether it's in Selma or in Slovenia, you know, when one of our discussions ends, one of the most common things that our students will say, and it's even our chapter presidents, not just the students that are passionate about this work, and they'll say, wow, I did not think this was possible. So I think part of the challenge here is that people have been convinced that what we're trying to discuss at this conference is impossible. And if we leave this room with the assumption that, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, the folks that we try to meet are going to be able to sniff out that inauthenticity. So I think we have to really meet people where they are and understand their why. And I think that can open up a lot.
No, look, I think it's a terrific insight. My suspicion is people don't leave this conference thinking it's not possible, partly because these are a bunch of, I called a friend of mine here a degenerate do-gooder. You know, it's just like, can't help themselves. But I think what people oftentimes are concerned about is, does the dialogue, the sharing of stories, the understanding, the insight lead to action that in turn serves our communities? Because if it doesn't, then it starts feeling like a luxury. Nice to do, but we got bigger fish to fry. And so I want to ask each of you about this because, as I mentioned in my remarks, when you start trying to build bridges, you're vulnerable, not just that the other side rejects your overtures or lies to you or doesn't follow through on commitments, but you're also vulnerable within your own organizations, within your own communities and base. And you know, I'm sure all of you would sort of agree that things hurt worse, criticism hurts worse when it comes from your own oftentimes. And so I'm interested in how you think about managing your own allies, organizations, the people who are working alongside you consistently in your cause, and the possibility that they start feeling like you are selling out, letting folks down, which, by the way, I'll just shift to a political context here, happens across the political spectrum. I cannot tell you how many Republicans, when I was in the Senate and when I was president, I actually knew well, knew better, were oftentimes feeling as if they were taking positions they did not believe in because a base had been activated or a media personality had targeted them and said, you know, this is a Republican in name only, this is a sellout, and it had very real political consequences for them. A number of them ended up just leaving office altogether, not because of they didn't necessarily have the stories that would surprise and encourage us about this, but because it was hard to take the heat from their own base. So I'm wondering if you've got stories to share that might help people think about that in a way that is useful. Go ahead.
Sure. I think you bring up a really, really good point, which is the point of incentives. We've set up a structure in which where you win office, where you gain influence, where you make money is through outrage. You know, if you're on social media, the first thing that people will tell you is the way that you build an influence on a platform is by trying to play to the outrageous industrial complex, which is a lot of folks have coined that term as a way to articulate that outrage sits at the center of every decision we make. And this makes me think about the summit that we host every year, because I think a lot about how do you actually shift the real incentives, because the incentives right now do not align towards solving problems. The incentives align towards talking to the most ideological extremes on each side. So every year we host this annual summit where we bring together student leaders from across the country. It's 1 to 2 presidents from each chapter. And you'll meet the most ardent liberal students, the most ardent conservative students, not your sort of squishy middle. You'll meet different demographic groups, different identities. And I ask myself every time we host that summit, what actually unites everybody here? Like, why are they here? Because they're passionately and objectively advocating for a process, not an outcome. It's a process of pluralism. Why is that? Every time we come away from that conference, we realize that these students are united not by what they believe, but how they believe. There's a new divide, I think, in our politics. And I see that especially at the grassroots levels. And this is not elite college campuses and high schools across the country or where our chapters work, in rural communities and urban communities. The new divide we see is a divide between the majority of people that believe in open-minded dialogue as a way to be able to see and understand each other, to feel heard, and the loud minority of folks that believe that the only way we win at this moment is through ideological rigidity. And when we start to think about it in the terms of there being a new divide, I've found personally that these students are motivated by seeing the fact that open-mindedness instead of closed-mindedness is the way that they're going to build their coalitions. That the way that they're going to achieve change is by realizing that the problem in their communities is not the problem of division necessarily, because we've been divided historically, but a problem of fear. And that fear being propagated by the loudest voices. So the question is, how do we elevate the majority of people that believe in the tenets of pluralism at a moment where it's necessary?
So, at my birthday party about 2 weeks ago, my mom said, I am her biggest supporter and her biggest critic. And
sounds like a mom.
yes. And my mom and I do things very differently. And she is also in Selma. And so she said to me once, and this was painful for us, she said, I feel like you are separating from me because you're choosing white people over me. And that's difficult. She was in pain. She was hurt. I was hurt. Definitely not the case. More about how we do things and my intentionality. We often have the same goal of reconciliation, but again, I'm very careful about having unarmed truth. And so I think that it can be difficult when you're doing this work and people see you doing things and don't understand how you're doing them. And you don't have the conversation enough for them to understand. And that was my fault in that. I will also say that I talk about love a lot, and love for so many people has been tainted that it feels very weak and anemic. And when I speak about love, I'm not talking about love absent of power, but love that actualizes power.
It's a great way to put it. Nick, anything you want to talk about in terms of just pressure within the group and strategies you deal with?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I like criticism and I don't like discreditation. And I think this is an important difference.
I'm sorry, you like criticism, but you don't like?
Discreditation.
Discreditation.
Yeah. And I think it's a
How do you define discreditation?
Discreditations are like fake news, attacks, comments.
Okay.
Criticism is when people tell you that you're doing shit when you're doing shit, or when you're wrong. This is like the difference.
I think that's a very
me.
good definition.
Yeah, thank you. So what I wanted to say is that for me, before like stories, before campaigning, before like being on the streets with people, what comes first is the content. For what we stand in my organization, what we want to achieve. And when you have the content in the first row, everything else, like all the additional noise, all the egos that we have, all the fights that we have, like all the like hard things that come to your way become much, much smaller. And when you're focused on content, you are focused on delivering. And I think that what this year could learn us is that we need more than ever democracy that delivers, democracy which provides life full of dignity for everyone, peace, and life that we want to live. And if we are focusing on delivering, we will like think about other stuff way less, and we will be doing things. And I think that the only solution to the situation in which we are is hard work. And this is the only thing that we need to do now.
I'm a big proponent of hard work, but I want to lift up a couple of things that were said. That powerful story, Anika, that you told about the conversation with your mom, and then you said, you know, you've got a process, but she's not always seeing it, right? And it is a good example generally of effective leadership in a pluralistic society doesn't just require you to be spending all your time focused outward. If you want to be an effective leader in a pluralistic democracy, you actually have to spend more time inward in terms of making sure people know what you are doing, what you're trying to accomplish, that you have set a common goal that we all agree to. Here's our rationale. You can criticize, maybe you disagree with my strategy, but a lot of times, I think, people will, they may still criticize your strategy, but if they know that you're coming from the right place, then it will be criticism as opposed to discreditation. The second point, which I think is right on target. It's easier to say no to your own base, to reject, to know what compromises to reject and what compromises to take, when you are talking about a concrete goal and not talking in the abstract. And so this goes to the point I was making earlier about tying dialogue, work, bridge building with a goal that delivers for people. Yeah, so I was talking to some content creators earlier today, and I just used as a simple example that is fairly well known, the Affordable Care Act. I got whooped on throughout that process. It wasn't single payer, there's no public option, there's this, there's that. And let me tell you, I know criticism is relative. When it's President getting criticized, it's very noisy and very loud, and my staff is having to, catch all kinds of flack from various groups. But you know what? Generally speaking, we did not stress. I might occasionally curse, but did not stress about it because we had clarity about what we were trying to get done. And I think a lot of times, Manu, what you were referring to in terms of what's happening in the, the Twitterverse, the comments, this and that and the other, happens when it's not tied to something concrete. When it's tied to something concrete, you feel pressure because you now have to deliver. And that's where criticism is legitimate if you don't deliver. Or if somebody says, I think there's a better strategy to deliver. But if we're, when you're just talking ideologically, that's when I think the loudest voices, the most rigid voices tend to predominate. We're running out of time. So I'm going to just do I won't say this is a lightning round, but I'm going to just throw out a couple of things. Anika, as you think about your work, how do you set sort of red lines in terms of what you can compromise, what you can't? Manu, obviously there was a lot of attention about college campuses, in the aftermath of October 7th in Gaza, and I'm interested in what kind of resolutions, not complete resolutions, but how did people think about rules governing how, if any, governing how people can voice their opinions, not in the settings you've set up, but more broadly, so that they don't feel as if they're being silenced or they have to be overly polite when they feel on either side that the stakes are too high. And then, Nika, we'll close up with you. You've got all kinds of, Nika's got a lot of stuff going on. And I'm wondering, just as you move from working in Slovenia, right? It's obviously a country of several million, but it's still
2 million.
Yeah, a couple million. But it's a small country, a little smaller than Chicago. So there's an opportunity for, certainly after all you've done, to get to know a lot of people. You've got a lot of relationships, a lot of history. And then now you're starting to work across Europe and across boundaries. And so how do you translate sort of the comfort level that you might feel working in your initial community? Because a lot of leaders here, they may start scaling up, and some lessons learned around these issues.
So I've had a lot of red lines over the years around people and issues, and red lines are often meant to protect, but when they're forts and not fences that can be removed and adjusted, they can actually be the thing that harms instead of protecting. And so when I was in high school, it was, I can't have stupid friends, until I became the stupid friend because I didn't get to the root causes to know how to address the issues myself. When I was in college, it was, I don't do direct service because we need to teach people how to fish and remove the systemic barriers. And to my community service advisor was like, what are people going to eat while you're doing all of that, right? So I've had lots of them. So the older I get, the more my red lines soften, right? And not in terms of values, but in terms of the what my values produce. And so I think I know that my red line is love. I feel like we've tried all the other ways and we fail. And so my question is like, what would it look like if we institutionalize love? Like, what would our court system look like if love was the goal? And so victims, survivors, the person who did harm, the community, everybody got what they need. What would the schools look like if we institutionalized love and every child had an individualized plan nurturing their gifts, talents, and skills so they could prosper from it? And so I think that, you know, we can't build the beloved community without being the beloved community. And so we've tried all these other ways, and ultimately, like Dr. King said, I'm sticking with love. Love is my red line.
Okay, I like that. Madam?
You know, when you think about the work that's happening in colleges across the country and high schools across the country, the theme that everyone will echo in all of these discussions is this is one of the first times they felt loved. I'm being honest with you. Like, I don't think we realize, at least, I don't know, I've not been doing this work as long as a lot of the folks here, and there's some amazing mentors that I've got here and a lot of great lightning talk speakers beforehand, but I think we underestimate how actually lonely people are. I really think we do. And I think we also don't actually realize that when we feel lonely, a lot of other people feel that same way. So when you think about inculcating an environment on a college campus or in high school, in an academic environment where the North Star is we're actually going to reward learning, where people are going to feel comfortable, because if they can't challenge each other's ideas here, where else are they going to challenge their ideas? I think the key lies in accurately diagnosing the problem. And I would posit to say that the problem is not division. The problem is not that there's too many ideas and we can't figure it out. The problem is that there's a culture of fear. And that culture of fear is built not by most people in this room, or frankly most people in American society. That culture of fear is built by the loud minority of voices that benefit from being loud. And so what we've got to do is we've got to figure out, how do you elevate the majority of people that care about this work? How do you build the permission structure? So when it comes to policies, how do you incentivize pluralism as the norm? When a student shows up to campus, how do you create faculty interventions? How do you ensure that their dorm life is politically and ideologically diverse? And here's the coolest thing about our chapters. People actually make friends with people that are different than them and leave the room saying, huh, I actually learned more from this friendship. And when people can actually feel that this isn't some fake prescription, but it is core to their soul, that is a part of the human condition. I mean, you discuss the legacy of our democracy in a really articulate way. By 2045, the United States is going to be the most diverse democracy in the history of democracies. This has never happened before. Imagine I told you there was a society of 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, heavily armed. Trying to make it work? So I would just articulate that I think this work is offense. And I think young people are ready to pick up the mantle of dialogue because they see this as the tool for the moment right now.
Okay.
So I spent 1 year at Columbia as Obama scholar, and at that time, yeah, so at that time I became obsessed with two different ideas. First was that it's not enough that I do campaigns in Slovenia because it is too little, and that we need to scale up on the whole Europe because we need a European movement. And because I was in US just in the time when constitutional courts take away the reproductive rights, I became obsessed with the idea how to make sure that Europe don't become US. And the thing that we decided to do was that with my fellow Obama leaders from the program which I visited like 2 years ago was to start leading a campaign to collect 1 million signatures to protect abortion on the level of European Union. All the people said, I mean, most of the people said that we will never make it, that we are crazy. But we decided firstly to use social media ads, to use like fancy words, like flashy campaigns, and the thing didn't work. And what we realized when we were building this like large-scale movement is that actually you need to do it in the same way again and again. Go to every single city, go to every single community, talk with people, invite with you politicians, invite with you small businesses, invite with you like different people that you would never imagine, and with this you can move a change. And right now we have more than 900,000 signatures, and we will succeed.
Well, I know you'll succeed, because that's what you do. Well, look, I could not be prouder of the work that all of you are doing, and the way you articulate and describe your work, I'm sure has inspired the audience, not just here in the auditorium, but folks who are watching. I just want to emphasize to everybody that you can hear the degree to which these are some soft-hearted but hard-headed people. They're not doing this because they've got nothing else to do, and they are looking for practical results, and that, I think, maybe is a thought to leave all of you with. This idea that there is a contradiction between listening to others, hearing their stories, identifying potential connections, that there's a contradiction between that and your convictions. That somehow if you really have convictions, then you aren't interested in that. That's something I really want to dispel. And just to give you one final example of the practical benefit of what we're talking about, for you to achieve the aims that you have, I'll just use a very brief example. I was elected president primarily because of a bunch of 20-something-year-olds who were running around Iowa for a year. And they'd just be parachuted into these communities, and they'd be living with some family, and you got some black guy from Brooklyn, suddenly he's never seen corn, he's with corn and cows, and you got some Asian guy from San Francisco, and he's running around, trying to like be an assistant coach for Little League, even though he didn't play baseball, and they're there all the time. So I'm getting all kinds of stories from these folks. I think the most important story that I got from these folks who really were responsible for our first victory in Iowa and then launched the rest of my campaign, the most important story for today is the story from one of our volunteers who is now a speechwriter for Michelle, outstanding, and he tells me he comes back from canvassing, knocking on doors, talking to people about our campaign, and he describes how he knocks on a door in sort of a rural, pretty conservative area. Woman opens the door. My guy says, I'm here for the Obama campaign. He's got all the paraphernalia, and we're just trying to find out, if we can count on your support for the caucuses. And the woman says, hold on, and turns back into the house and yells at her husband, honey, who are we supporting in the caucus? And he says, yeah, we're supporting the N-word. We're supporting the, and she turns back and says, yeah, we're supporting Obama. And my canvasser marks it down. 2 points from that. 1, it's a game of addition. 2, I was more confident about that person was going to support me in the caucus. Because hope is honest. And that was honest. All right, everybody. Give these guys a big round of applause. They were fantastic.